I'm Sean Gilsdorf. I'm the Administrative Director of the Committee on Medieval Studies here at Harvard University. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, which is the second installment in a year-long lecture series on Africa in the medieval world, co-sponsored by Medieval Studies, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies, the Department of African and African American Studies, and the Center for African Studies here at Harvard University. As our inaugural speaker, Steve Kaplan, pointed out a few weeks ago, the value and the utility of a complex and contested term like medieval for understanding a complex and contested term like Africa is itself contested and complex. Nonetheless, our hope in organizing this lecture series is to revisit the notion of medieval Africa, or perhaps more appropriately, the notion of Africa's relationship with what scholars recently have dubbed the global Middle Ages, and to continue and extend a series of conversations between scholars of Africa, Byzantium, the Islamic world, and medieval Europe, begun in our 2015 Symposium on Trans-Saharan Africa and continued in last year's Christian Africa Conference. We were fortunate to have Steve Kaplan, a scholar of immense curiosity, intellectual breadth, and critical acumen, launch this year's conversations. We're equally fortunate to continue those conversations with tonight's speaker, Giovanni Ruffini. He's particularly well suited to the task at hand. After receiving his early training as a medieval European historian at the University of Chicago and San Francisco State, he turned his sights onto the world of ancient, late antique, and Byzantine Egypt and Northeast Africa, receiving his PhD at Columbia under the tutelage of the renowned papyrologist Roger Bagnall. After postdoctoral fellowships at Columbia and New York University's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, Giovanni joined the faculty of Fairfield University, where he now is professor of history and director of the program in classical studies. He's published extensively on the history of the late antique and Byzantine world, including his book Social Networks in Byzantine Egypt, which appeared in 2008, as well as a prosopography of and a recent monograph on the Upper Egyptian village of Aphrodito, modern Ashukal. His talk tonight, however, will focus on Giovanni's other major area of teaching and research, namely the social, economic, and religious history of the Nubian kingdoms from the 6th through the 12th century CE. Working diligently and creatively with the rich but still little understood corpus of medieval Nubian documents, most of them still unedited and almost all of them untranslated, Professor Ruffini has helped us better understand how Nubia's traders, writers, priests, and craftsmen lived, worked, disputed, and worshipped. His many journal articles and book chapters, the journal Dotawo that he helped establish, as well as his landmark 2012 study, Medieval Nubia, A Social and Economic History, have helped to bring much needed attention to this critical but often overlooked chapter in Africa's history. And we're delighted that he's here tonight to share his reflections on what Nubia could and can teach us about the relationship between Nubia, Africa, and the medieval world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Giovanni Ruffini.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for having me here today. I think the Committee on Medieval Studies, the Hutchins Center, and the Department of African and African American Studies are doing crucial work in advancing critical thinking on Africa in the medieval world with this series. As I have been told, this series has several goals. Here I'm quoting the email I received an invitation. The first is to interrogate the value and applicability of medieval Africa as a rubric for understanding the broader African ecumene in the pre-colonial past. The second is to cultivate a better and deeper sense of the dynamic relationship between Africa's pre-modern past and its modern-day present, approaching trans-Saharan or medieval African history from a longue durée perspective, in which contemporary social, cultural, and political events are understood in the context of the deeper past, unquote. The organizing committee invited me to address these questions from the framework of my work on Nubian social, political, and religious history in the post-classical period. I was happy to accept that invitation because Harvard. But I quickly realized that I found the relevant questions to be unanswerable if I spoke solely about Nubia. So with your indulgence, I think I'm going to widen my scope a little bit here and speak about all three great civilizations of the Nile Valley: Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia. I cannot say as much about Egypt as I would like, given time constraints, but I think Copts shared too much with Nubians and Ethiopians to break up the band. I will make the case for treating these three civilizations as forming an ideological unity. I will also propose that the nature of that ideological unity provides us some way of getting closer to the nature of medieval Africa. If you accept my arguments on these points, we may be able to end by proposing some sort of alternative rubric for thinking about medieval Nubia, at least in the Nile, for thinking about medieval Africa, at least in the Nile Valley. I would like to start with a word about the historiography of that word, medieval, as it applies to my own particular specialty, medieval Nubia. Since I wrote a book, as Sean said, with the phrase medieval Nubia in the title, you might imagine that I had given the significance of the phrase some serious thought, and in fact, you'd be wrong. Sad to say, I use the term almost reflexively, having inherited it from several generations of scholarship on the subject. The most obvious examples here are two of the leading Anglophone archaeologists of Nubia, Derek Welsby in England and Bill Adams in the United States, who also used the word in their book titles. I don't know whether they gave the phrase serious thought either, except to say that medieval is the thing that comes after ancient. So, having myself been accused of Eurocentrism in my work on medieval Nubia, and being of a generation raised wholly in a post-colonial world, I think that my colleagues and I in Nubian studies have come to see that medieval rubric as problematic, particularly for its Eurocentric chronological assumptions. Now, I admit to a lingering tendency to lean heavily on the word medieval in casual conversation about Nubia. It just has a quick and easy chronological meaning. If you ask 1,000 history professors to give a date range for the medieval period, you will probably get 1,000 different answers, but they're probably also going to distribute nicely around the bookends of 500 to 1500 AD. And this is fantastic for Nubian studies, since it is more or less the time period in which we see Nubia begin to reunify after the collapse of Meroe, and then ultimately the time period in which we see it collapse and disappear as a central state for good 1,000 years later. Now, if we want to come up with a better rubric for this period in Nubian history, and if we want that rubric to teach us anything about Africa in the longue durée perspective, I think we should ask what these people themselves want to be called. Now, I just published, as Sean also mentioned, a book on a small town in Byzantine Egypt, in which I rejected most of the scholarly constructs used for interpreting the data from that town, because I thought that the people in that town would themselves not have understood what those constructs did or what they said. Likewise for the term medieval Nubia, which etymologically refers to a civilization in between two other things. In the European context, at least, a great past and a rebirth of that great past. Nubians would not have understood this concept, still less shared that sense of their history. I think we can say the same thing for Egyptians and for Ethiopians. So what I want to do then is explore these three civilizations with an eye towards what they say in their texts about their own histories, about their own identities, about their own geographies, and see if any sort of unified whole can emerge from that exploration. We're only going to make a brief stop in Egypt to look at how the Copts saw the Nubians. The best glimpse into this question comes in what are called the Scrolls of Timotheus. Now, I apologize for having no flashy PowerPoint presentation. If you saw these scrolls, they're 6 feet long. They're gorgeously illuminated things. But they're very hard to get on a page because they're so long. You can't get a good photo of them at all. Massive paper scrolls. They were found at Khazar-Abrim, northern Nubia. They date to the 1370s. They contain Coptic and Arabic versions of appointment letters from the Coptic patriarch in Cairo to a Nubian named Timotheus, elevating him to the bishopric of Faras, the regional capital of northern Nubia. The scrolls were found with a body buried at Khazar-Abrim, which suggests that Timotheus never made it to Faras, died in Khazar-Abrim with his scrolls. The scrolls themselves indicate that he was enthroned in Egypt, perhaps because conditions in Nubia made it uncertain that he could rely on the presence of an adequate number of bishops in Nubia for a proper elevation. So the text itself, what does it say? The Coptic version of the text begins with an address to, quote, God's most Christ-loving priests, deacons, subdeacons, readers, psalmists, the people of the city of Pharos, with Nubia, its nome, beloved spiritual children, unquote. From the Coptic Pope Gabriel, who describes himself as Archbishop of, quote, the great city of Rakote and Babylon and its territories, and Nubia and the Ethiopians, and the 5 cities which are in the west, and Africa, unquote. The first sentence of the letter itself addresses all the Orthodox people who are in the territory of the city of the Christ-loving Pharos and Nubia and all its territories. Now, 2 of the witnesses to the enthronement described Timotheus as sitting on the throne of Pharos, quote, in the country of Nubia, unquote. Now here I want to point out that this is a very loose translation. The scribes do not say Nubia, they say Lubi, Libya, presumably confusing the term for the Greek Pentapolis in Libya, which was once under the jurisdiction of the Coptic Patriarch, with the term for Nubia in the south. Note also the other terms this letter uses: the country of Nubia, the territory of Nubia, no reference to a kingdom, no reference to its king. The region of Pharos is called the nome. This is the same term that is used to indicate administrative divisions or provinces in Pharaonic or Greco-Roman Egypt, not one that is applicable to or used in Christian Nubia, at least as far as present evidence indicates. The text does not speak of Nubians at all, but rather the Orthodox people in the territory of Nubia. The Arabic version of the appointment letter of Bishop Timotheus follows a slightly different formula with basically the same gist. It writes to the Orthodox people of the provinces of Nubia who are subject to the decree of the Church of the Lady and the Apostles. So I don't want to read too deeply into what may simply be phonetic confusion in the Coptic version between Nubia and Libya. It seems that this text is relatively indifferent to geography and not particularly interested in ethnic or linguistic or political categories either. Borders here are non-existent. Nubia is just one province in a larger whole. What matters about the people in that province of Nubia is their Christian orthodoxy. Now, I have a chapter on texts from medieval Nubia in the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Nubian Studies. Some of what I wrote in that chapter on Nubia's sense of world history helps us answer some of the questions that we're dealing with in this series. Medieval Nubia's most basic textbook on world history is the Bible. We have nothing from the narrative books of the Old Testament written in indigenous Nubian, only in Greek or in Coptic. But even if the surviving bits of the Old Testament that we have from Nubia are the only ones that were known in Nubia, they would still provide an intriguing glimpse into the Nubian understanding of that past, the distant past. Nubians would know the history of the Holy Land and surrounding areas. They would know of the Archangel Raphael's trip to Media so that Tobit could see again. They would know of the captives sent from Jerusalem and Judah into exile in Babylon. They would have heard of the humbling of the Moabites, the prophecy of the destruction of Damascus, the description of the destruction of Phoenician Tyre. And I think this is very interesting considering recurring international tension between Egypt and Nubia. They would have read the promise in the Bible that the idols of the Egyptians will fall. That's deep history, Old Testament biblical history. Now, on rare occasions in Nubian texts, Roman late antiquity comes into focus as well. The 8th century Anchorite grotto in Pharos in northern Nubia is a fantastic example in this regard. Its walls record the sayings of a number of late antique monks, Evagrius, Azaeus, Pacom, Arsenios. The 5th century sayings of the Desert Fathers preserved memory in Nubia of the earliest ages of Christian monasticism in Egypt. That same grotto lists the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, young men who hid in a cave during the persecutions of the Roman Emperor Decius in circa 250 AD and awoke 2 centuries later. You can imagine how strange this must have been for them amazed to find a transformed, Christianized Roman Empire. And the change in their pockets didn't work anymore. It was a big problem. The grotto also lists the 40 martyrs of Sebaste, soldiers who were victims of the persecution of Licinius in 320 AD. From the Nubian perspective, that Roman history is simply part of Christian history. A Greek text from Khazar-Ibrim narrates a popular legend and one of the best death stories of a Roman emperor when I teach my late antique class, the Emperor Julian, 361 to 363, in which the martyr Mercurius kills the impious and ungodly emperor during his war against the Persian Empire. The emperor is shot in the back, essentially. Reference to the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, another Roman emperor, 284 to 305, appears in two of the most common Nubian dating formulas. The first one dates a text by the number of years from Diocletian. This is common in Nubia from the 7th through the 10th centuries, tapers off in the 11th century. The second dating formula dates a text by the number of years from the martyrs killed under Diocletian, and this was standard from the 11th century on. Now, throughout medieval Nubia, then, the literate classes thus retained an awareness of their own chronological relationship to a central event in Roman history. Constantinople appears in Nubian texts as a center of royal power. The Archangel Raphael intercedes for the famous Christian emperor Theodosius the Great. His son Honorius is a God-loving king known for his piety and his plan to build on earth a church to the Archangel Raphael. Now, these memories of the Roman past, they come through a homily on Raphael attributed to John Chrysostom. Himself, he's one of the church fathers who's best known in Nubia. He's a major player in the ecclesiastical history of Constantinople during the Theodosian dynasty in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Now, no evidence suggests that these memories run very deep in Nubia. Nothing suggests that anyone in Nubia could date Theodosius in relation to Diocletian, or that anybody knew what precisely Honorius was king of, right? We might even imagine people in Nubia seeing no real historical distinction between the kings of the Old Testament, the kings of the Roman world, and the kings of their own day. We see some of this blurring of lines in the miracle of St. Minas. It's one of the most important pieces of Old Nubian literature in translation. Minas was a Roman soldier from Egypt who suffered martyrdom for his Christian faith early in the 4th century AD. Versions of his life and his miracles survive with greater or lesser details in Greek, Arabic, Ethiopic, and Old Nubian. The Old Nubian version of the text, found at Edfu, it's now in the British Museum, is probably a 9th or 10th century text. Given the relative effort that it takes to translate any literary work, and given how little Old Nubian literature survives, it's worth considering the translator's motives and the translator's methods. Presumably, hagiography is supposed to edify. Nubian readers should be inspired by the piety of St. Minas. What interests me in this text isn't the miracles, though, it's the level of detail, or really the lack of detail. When Minas works his miracles in the Nubian version, the miracles alone matter. Historical setting is completely irrelevant. Okay? The texts mention Alexandria and nearby Mareotis, but whether these places are near or far for the reader, we have no idea. There is no mention of time. When did Minas live? When did these miracles take place? It doesn't matter. For the reader of Nubian hagiography, late antique Egypt and medieval Nubia blur together as one. Now, in the same manuscript, we find Old Nubian versions of the Nicene canons. The prestige of the Council of Nicaea led later Christian authors to add additional canons to the original 20 issued at Nicaea, in hopes of using that council's authority to bolster later arguments. The surviving Old Nubian canons of Nicaea are unique. They do not appear to be based on any earlier antecedents, even though an additional 60 Arabic canons are known from Egyptian texts. The Nubians made up their own. The Old Nubian canons are unmistakably about food. They're concerned with food gifts to the church with proper compensation for those gifts from priests, how much of the gifts the priests had to share. I argue that this attention to food was directly related to medieval Nubian culture practices of eating as a means of tightening social cohesion and solidifying economic transactions. If I'm right about this, the Nicene canons are an interesting way of enforcing this social practice. Medieval Nubian church fathers are asserting indigenous customs, and doing so using the theological authority of Roman bishops who have been dead for 500 years. Now, I think this is an interesting sense of continuity with the past. I would say with someone else's past, but the point may be that the Nubians themselves did not feel that way. The most significant of Nubian kings in the 700s AD was somebody named Mercurios, whose Christian piety earned him the epithet the New Constantine. We know very little about Mercurios or about the circumstances surrounding the birth of this nickname, but it is striking that when Nubian kings looked for a role model, they chose Roman ones. They had no interest in their pre-Christian Meroitic predecessors. Any continuity with that ancient history was completely broken. Now, earlier in this talk, I suggested the importance of considering what these people called themselves. Nubians, when they were writing in their own language, spoke of Nubia as Dotawo, and their king as the Uru of Dotawo. But when writing in other languages, particularly in Greek, they had a wider range of options to choose from. And some of their choices, I think, are revealing. In 883 AD, a high-ranking Nubian official named Johannes, at the royal capital of Dongola, received a Greek epitaph referring to his father, the Nubian king Zacharias, as Zacharias Augustus. 4 years later, another high-ranking official named Marian Kuda received a Greek epitaph referring to authority he received from the Nubian king Georgios, George, who he refers to as Auton men ton Kaisera, that very Caesar. If this were the Roman Empire, we could infer relative levels of seniority, with the Augustus, the senior partner, the Caesar, the junior partner. There's no hint of that here, but these men are clearly trying to make some sort of political point. If they had wanted to simply call their king a king, they could have done so easily enough. The Greek word for king, basileus, is well known to them, and in fact is used in one of these epitaphs. Instead, these men have deliberately appropriated Roman imperial titles, perhaps for prestige reasons, or as an attempt to indicate some sort of symbolic continuity with or connection to the original owners of these titles. Now, these funerary inscriptions, they do make up a significant percentage of our textual evidence from medieval Nubia. One of the most famous examples is the bilingual Greek and Old Nubian memorial for another King George, this one who died in 1157 AD. The inscription was first seen by Westerners in 1920 in the so-called Der al-Syrian, or Monastery of the Syrians, in the Wadi Natrun region of Egypt. It's not a tombstone, it's an offering tray, commemorating the king's death and offering various formulaic prayers for him, asking, quote, God of the spirits and all flesh, to rest the soul of your servant King George in a shining place, unquote. The contents of the inscription, I think, are less interesting than its location itself in Egypt. It was presumably found in Egypt because King George died in Egypt. This is the scholarly consensus in Nubian studies, that George ended his life in monastic retirement in Egypt, having abdicated his throne and having left Nubia several years before. This is not a unique event in Nubian history. Roughly 80 years before that, in the 1000s, a Nubian king, Solomon, abdicated and left for Egypt, where he lived in a monastery until his death in the 1080s or 1090s. Now, if my own reconstruction of Nubian politics in the second half of the 12th century is correct, we have a third king, Moses George, who seems to have followed in this tradition. Now, this Moses George disappears from the documentary evidence in the 1190s when we see a man named Basil succeeding him as king of Nubia. Robert de Clary's Chronicle of the Fourth Crusade describes a meeting in Constantinople in 1203 between the Crusaders and a king of Nubia who had come to the Byzantine capital after making pilgrimage first to Jerusalem. To my knowledge, no one has guessed at the identity of this Nubian king, but given the chronology, it seems tempting to suppose that it was Moses George himself, having followed the example of several of his predecessors and having left the throne in search of monastic or at least pious retirement. It is said that he planned to leave Constantinople for Rome and then proceed on to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Other evidence makes clear that Moses George was self-consciously a Christian king. His reign was eventful. He actually outlasts on the throne attacks on Nubia ordered by Saladin. What we know of Moses George suggests a striking sense of self-confidence given the threat that he faced from this invasion. After the raid into Nubia, Shams ad-Dawla, Saladin's brother, sent an emissary to the Nubian king, who goes unnamed in the report that survives in the Arab historians of the event, but Moses George is the only logical candidate. The emissary describes the king as completely hairless, nearly naked, quote, mounting a horse without a saddle and being wrapped only with a robe of satin. When the emissary greeted Moses George, the king, quote, burst into wild laughter and ordered his men to stamp a cross on my hand with red-hot iron. Unquote. This is not a man who thinks he just lost the war he just lost, but a man who's confident in his ability to resist Egyptian aggression. One whose sense of his own kingship, I think, is intimately connected to his own sense of Christianity. This intimate relationship is not an isolated feature of the reign of King Moses George. Indeed, foreign, usually Arabic, sources often speak of the Nubian kings as priest kings, and their particular corner of Christendom almost as if it were a theocracy. I think that leaning on foreign sources too firmly is a bad idea, so I always want these impressions to be confirmed by internal evidence. When I was translating the old Nubian texts from Khazar-Ibrim, I found one document that I thought came the closest we have so far to an expression of Nubian political philosophy. Its author expressly states that, quote, God kept the king safe through his patience, and that, quote, God gave to you and your eparch, that's regional governor, always causing both of you to be safe, unquote. The four most commonly named people in the introductory dating protocols of old Nubian documents are, in order, the king, the queen mother, the eparch of Nobadia, or northern Nubia, and the local bishop, whichever region you're in at the time. This is a clear indication, I think, of the Nubian sense of the dual importance of secular and sacred. Now recall the use of the title Caesar in the 9th century epitaph I mentioned earlier. I want to draw attention to an inscription left at the Deir al-Bahadra monastery in Egypt by a Nubian monk named Joseph. Joseph held a series of offices at the royal court in Dongola, serving a series of Nubian kings. One of these posts was royal counselor to King Kudanbes, a position that Joseph renders as Kesaron Prodre, counselor of the Caesar. This inscription is clearly an outlier. It dates to April 7, 1322. It's put up in a monastery in Aswan by a Nubian in residence outside of Nubian royal territory, at a period in which Nubia itself is falling into civil war. Okay? And as importantly, Caesar has not appeared in the regular Nubian titulature in 500 years. Still, an outlier is evidence for something, even if it is simply the case that Joseph himself is a bit of a learned eccentric. It is still nonetheless true that as late as the 14th century, a Nubian thought that linking his king to the Roman imperial past is a marker of legitimacy and prestige. Now also in this vein, I want to draw attention to an unnamed Nubian church at Abdelgader. If the typology of Christian churches in Nubia proposed by Bill Adams is correct, the church belongs to the terminal Christian period of Nubian history, specifically in this case, the second half of the 1400s AD. One figure painted on the walls in that church is usually described in scholarship as an eparch of Nobadia, that is the highest ranking political official in northern Nubia. Not everybody agrees. Some people think it might actually be an image of the Nubian king himself. Now this image is very striking. On this man's dress, The dress itself is covered in double-headed eagles, and the man is carrying in his left hand what appears to be a Christian church. Now, this is iconography that would have been appropriate for any Byzantine emperor, I think. And if Adams is right, this is a Nubian church constructed after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Given the high level of uncertainty about the date of the church, the uncertainty about the identity of the figure and the intent behind the iconography, I don't want to push this point too far. But this image from Abdel-Gader does seem to me to be another example of a Nubian official self-consciously placed in the tradition of the Caesars and the Augusti. To summarize the Nubian evidence I've presented so far, we have a literary tradition that does not seem to draw very strong, solid lines between itself and its neighbors, and itself and its predecessors. Nubia and Egypt blur together geographically. The Nubian kingdom and the Roman Empire blur together politically. Nubia's explicit expressions of sovereignty are both Roman and Christian, treating the two categories as indistinct, if not actually synonymous. Nubian kings are called Augustus. They act against their enemies in the name of the cross. Some of this may be purely circumstantial. The Nubian historical tradition just may not have enough raw material necessary to draw hard and fast distinctions between some of these categories. But some of this does seem to me to suggest the presence of a conscious ideology, one we see throughout the Nile Valley. To make this clear, I want to turn now to the third great civilization of the Nile Valley, Ethiopia. Now, as many of you know, I am a Roman historian by training, and teaching Roman history is my bread and butter at Fairfield University. But Ethiopia, in fact, was my first love, the first place I ever visited overseas. It looms large in my understanding of history. Sometimes when a student of mine asks me when the Roman Empire fell, I like to tell them 1974. In addition to being the year of my birth, 1974 marks the final year of the reign of Ethiopia's last emperor, Haile Selassie. The Derg's removal of the emperor from the palace in September of that year marked the end of the Solomonic dynasty, the last form of government in the world to have ever laid claim to any aspect of Roman imperial sovereignty. The Christian kings of Nubia had done so, as we've seen. So did the Holy Roman emperors. So did the Russian czars. Even the Ottoman sultans had done so, on occasion calling themselves the Kaiser-i Rum, the Caesars of Rome, after their conquest of Constantinople. Of course, the Ethiopian emperors are far better remembered for their dynastic ideology of descent from King Solomon via the Queen of Sheba. This tradition gave the Ethiopian emperors a direct connection to the Old Testament past and an indirect connection ultimately to Jesus himself, their distant cousin, many times removed. The classic source text for all of this is the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of the Kings. The text of the Kebra Nagast in its current form appears to be a compilation of material assembled in the early 1300s, although not everyone agrees on this. The text itself claims to be an Ethiopic translation of an Arabic translation of a Coptic original. Clearly, it's a grab bag of different material. Some of it, the pseudo-historical narrative of Solomon and Sheba, some of it late Roman church fathers, some of it gradually transformed memories of late antique history. It's that last category that interests me the most. Contemporary 6th century sources tell us that the Ethiopian Emperor Caleb and the Roman Emperor Justinian were in active communication in an attempt to coordinate military action in the Arabian Peninsula. Justinian to advance his wars against the Persian Empire, and Caleb to avenge Jewish persecution of Christians in Najran. This is how the Kebra Nagast remembers this story. The king of Rome, the king of Ethiopia, and the Archbishop of Alexandria were informed that they were to rise up to fight, to make war upon the enemies of God, the Jews, and they should destroy them. Justinus, the king of Rome, and Caleb, the king of Ethiopia, met together in Jerusalem where they were to divide between them the rulership of the earth. And for love's sake, and in brotherhood, they were to have jointly the royal title of King of Ethiopia. The one whom they chose to be named King of Rome was also to be called King of Ethiopia. And the King of Ethiopia likewise was to bear the name the King of Rome. And thus they became united in a common bond. This passage is almost at the end of the book, as if it's rhetorical climax. It is not, to my mind, all that different from what the Nubians were doing at more or less exactly the same time in the 1300s, calling their kings Caesar and Augustus. Indeed, one of the most common subjects of Ethiopian manuscripts is Roman history. Otto Neugebauer, the great scholar of Ethiopian astronomy and computus, wrote that for an Ethiopic author, Roman history was of interest only so far as it was directly related to Christianity. I'm not really sure he was right about this. It is true that Ethiopian manuscripts pay a disproportionate attention to the Roman emperors of the 1st century AD because of their relevance for events from the life of Christ through the destruction of the Second Temple. But this is simply one element of focused attention in a much broader Ethiopian engagement in Roman history. Part of this engagement, I think, is a simple desire to understand the Ethiopian place in world history. To do this, you have to know how many generations there are from the present back to the Roman Imperial past, so that you can then know how many generations there are from then, Jesus' time, back to David, and from David back to Adam. Thus, we see several Ethiopian writers connecting the Ethiopian royal family, not just to its Solomonic roots, but to alleged Roman roots as well. One manuscript with an 18th century chronology of the Caesars from the birth of Christ to the destruction of the temple comes packaged with a chronology of world rulers through the 17th century Ethiopian Emperor Johannes I. The later chronicle of the Emperor Johannes IV, who was on the throne 1872 to 1889, describes that emperor's direct descent from the first king of Rome. According to this tradition, Solomon's sister, Eleni, married the son of the first king of Rome. Their son, quote, came to our country with a large force and settled in Agame. He had many children, whose names are recorded in writing in Akwesem and Gunda. From them was born Shum Agama Waldaleu. Waldaleu begot Sabagadus and Tabotu, and from her was born Weitzero Selas, mother of Johannes the king. It strains my imagination to explain what good this fictive genealogy did to an Ethiopian emperor who died in 1889 and whose greatest international conflicts were with the Ottomans, not the Italians. Other Ethiopian manuscripts do show a tendency to describe the Catholic popes as the kings of Rome. I wonder whether this genealogy of the Emperor Johannes as a descendant of Roman royal settlers in Ethiopia might not be a garbled memory of the presence of Catholic missionaries in that region in centuries past. This is purely speculative, and even if it is true, it does not detract from what I think is the main point, which is that the Roman imperial past seems to have had a tremendously long-lived intellectual gravitational pull in the Ethiopian historical tradition. Several Ethiopian manuscripts provide complete or partial summaries of a story describing how Ardami, a son of Solomon, became the king of Rome. An extended narrative of this story goes back at least as far as the Kebra Nagast. This fictive Roman genealogy still appears in Ethiopian manuscripts as late as the 20th century. Since Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty traces its ancestry to Menelik, the son of Solomon and the queen of Sheba, Ardami's fictive genealogy gives the Roman kings and the Ethiopian ones that cousin relationship. John Francesco Lucini has written some of the most interesting scholarship on Aksumite historiography and Roman elements in Ethiopian literary culture. He sees two separate strands at work in the Ethiopian tradition. The Kebra Nagast belongs to what he calls that first strand, promoting a heroic Aksumite kingship with a role in the last days. The second strand sees fundamental tension between church and state, which is an ever-present element in early Christianity. Here we should call to mind the Ethiopian tradition of the 9 saints, Romans, all of them, mainly from Syria, who fled anti-Monophysite persecution launched by the Orthodox Roman emperors, and are considered in Ethiopian Christian tradition the people responsible for the missionary work spreading the foundation of Christianity throughout Ethiopia in the 5th to 6th centuries AD. In the example of the 9 saints, Lucini's 2 separate strands of Ethiopian literary culture come together, I think, to explain one another. It is because there is a tension between church and state in Imperial Rome that Imperial Ethiopia must pick up the mantle of orthodoxy and emerge as its standard bearer. This is a vision once again present in the Kebra Nagast. Gregory the Wonder Worker says in that text, "I will reveal unto you concerning the king of Rome, how he shall transgress the covenant. This faith which we have ordered and laid down, shall a king sitting in Rome transgress. The Persians shall make war upon him and shall defeat him. This is what God showed me when I was in the pit. Ethiopia shall continue in the Christian faith until the coming of our Lord." So Ethiopia's relationship with Rome begins as a joint world sovereign and ends as the inheritor of its true faith. So, back to the original question. What do we call all of this if we don't like the term medieval? If we think it comes laden with too many Eurocentric, chronological, and cultural assumptions? We might speak of an Afro-Byzantine world. This approach goes back at least half a century to an interesting book called Africano-Byzantina, Byzantine Influence on Negro-Sudanese Culture, published in Athens by a Greek. As recently as 2014, an African university hosted a conference on Afro-Byzantine studies, by which they wrote, quote, "We understand the study of the African civilizations of which the development was influenced by Byzantine history and civilization," unquote. This was the University of Johannesburg, and the organizers of the conference were all themselves either Greek or of European descent. Note the choice of words, influence. Nubian studies scholars are starting to shy away from using that word influence because of its suggestion of a certain mindless passivity on the part of the people being influenced. As much as I use the term Byzantine in my own work, I try to be clear that I'm talking about a conscious adaptation of external traditions, not a blank slate reception of them. Some people would just have us drop the Afro or African part of the hyphenated phrase and simply call this medieval culture a Byzantine one. In Byzantine studies, it has in the last few generations been common to speak of the so-called Byzantine Commonwealth, a phrase that's used in multiple different ways. This refers to what we might think of as a Byzantine cultural hegemony, in some cases encompassing territory once within the borders of the receding Byzantine state, and in other cases, Russia, for example, expanding into new territory thanks to assertive Byzantine evangelism. Some people have suggested that we think of Nubia and Ethiopia as part of this Byzantine cultural commonwealth. This strikes me as a real stretch. It is certainly true that there are strong elements of Byzantine evangelism in the founding epics of Nubian and Ethiopian Christianity, but there is little evidence of the Byzantine Empire maintaining and cultivating these ties with any intentionality after the rise of Islam makes it harder to maintain direct ties. And on the Ethiopian side, at least, I don't think there's hardly any evidence at all for awareness of the survival of the Byzantine Empire after late antiquity. Thinking only of medieval Nubia, we might choose to prefer the term Christian Nubia or Christian Africa. In terms of Christian Nubia, more and more of my peers in Nubian studies are doing exactly that. The term has a respectable intellectual genealogy in the field. Hugo Monterey de Villard's seminal 1938 book Storia della Nubia Christiana is still widely cited. But that term, Christian Nubia, it feels incomplete to me. It is blind to the political ideology of the times. Christians do not need kings. They do not need to call their kings Caesar and Augustus. They do not need to self-consciously pick up the crown that fell when Mehmet the Conqueror took Constantinople. In the case of Ethiopia, they would not need to concoct fictive imperial genealogies or remember a fictive past in which Rome and Ethiopia shared world sovereignty. With those gaps in mind, I propose that we speak instead of Christian Imperial Africa. In my opinion, this term has several virtues. First, it strips away arbitrary chronological indicators. Second, it strips away the lingering whiff of Eurocentrism. Third, its use of the category Christian lets us speak of a single people, including Copts, Nubians, and Ethiopians, despite the linguistic and ethnic differences within that people. Fourth, its use of the category imperial helps us understand the Ethiopian expansionism and the Nubian territorial and political revisionism that's common throughout this period. Finally, the category imperial helps us place these three civilizations firmly in a family tree that sees itself descended from, or drawing legitimacy from, or inheriting the mantle of a Christian Roman Empire. The Nubian and Ethiopian kings are members of a college of Christian kings. They see their collective responsibility to include the security of the Coptic community in Egypt. Both Nubian and Ethiopian kings threaten, and in several instances deliver, military action against Egypt in retaliation for poor treatment of the Copts by the ruling Muslim authorities. So, what can all of this do for us in approaching the other goals of the series? For instance, to cultivate a better and deeper sense of the dynamic relationship between Africa's pre-modern past and its modern-day present. This is a harder question. Certainly I won't surprise anyone if I say that modern Ethiopia is shaped, in part, by an Orthodox Christian past. This doesn't get us very far. One of my favorite authors once remarked that the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. I like this phrase very much, and I think it held true in Africa 1,000 years ago, just as much as it holds true today. Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nubia clearly had a tremendous amount in common, but their futures arrived at different times, in different ways. This is why I don't like historical categories based on chronological periods. Different cultural characteristics of any given period come and go unevenly. Peter Brown once wrote that Roman life had always tended to coagulate in little oases, like drops of water on a drying surface. I like this phrase very much too, and I find it a useful way to think about Christian imperial Africa. It has been drying up for a very long time. In Nubia, it has been dry for 500 years. For millions of others up and down the Nile Valley, whose church services still call blessings down on Roman martyrs and Ethiopian emperors, the future has not yet completely arrived. Thank you. Absolutely. So we have a microphone, which we have to see.
Thank you, good brother. I loved your lecture.
Thank you.
Sorry, I apologize in advance, but I had to step out for the dean's call. But it was great. First of all, I'm so glad that that you take seriously the Crusaders' report of the visit of the emperor to Constantinople in 1203, because I did too, and I put that in my series, though I know it was disputed. It's so easy to say, well, he must have made it up. Then you think, why the hell would some idiot make this up? You know, it's too complicated to make up. It's too extraordinary to make it up. But my question is, how would Copts in Egypt, Ethiopians, and Nubians have viewed each other? You know, you said at the end, you know, one of your punchlines is, right? Let's see them as a continuous related civilization.
Right.
Which I'm certainly sympathetic to. But at the same time, how sympathetic would they have been? You know, what is the relationship between similarity and difference? And what are the dangers of grouping people? You know, my funny joke with Ethiopians and Eritreans is, you know, I like to, because of my DNA show, I like to try to guess where people are from.
Right.
And, you know, over the years, I've gotten better, right? I've had a lot more experience. So Ethiopians and Eritreans, you know, I go, you're Ethiopian. They go, nah, I'm an Eritrean. I go, God, the presidents are first cousins. You know, what's wrong with you? Yeah. But so when is a difference important and when is similarity important? What are the pitfalls of doing what you're doing, and how would those people view your reinterpretation?
Good question. So identity is a hopelessly tricky thing. We are always happy to be in a group with other people until we zoom in and change the scale of perspective, and then the people in that group are obviously in some different group until we zoom back out and realize we're part of a larger group. So it always depends on what the context is that we're talking about. All these people would have understood themselves to be Christians and therefore the same in respect to the other that is dominating the political life of the times. But when you zoom down and put the Muslims out of sight and out of mind, we're not the same at all. We're totally different people. How do you tell? Well, I think the best way to answer your question is to look at what they were doing at the monastic level. You know, when the Ethiopians go to Egypt, when the Nubians go to Egypt, and they come to the monasteries in Egypt, and the Egyptians have to figure out, what do we do with these people? Well, we're not going to put them in here with us. We're going to put them in that building over there, right? And so there's definitely a spatial organization in terms of how these people viewed their shared Christianity. All the ones of a type, them, not us, go together in that building over there. I mean, this is what you see in Jerusalem, too. The poor Ethiopian guy on the roof of the church says, well, they keep kicking us further and further upstairs, and we're going to be flying off the top of this church in a while, right? And so there's definitely a sense, yes, we are all shared Christians, but when it comes to sharing space, that commonality isn't there.
I have the mic. Thank you very much. And I have a related question, and let me frame it by saying I'm an Africanist, and I work mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but actually exploring a Christian site in the middle of Nigeria circa 1300 and Cameroon. So it's framed around that. 1325, there is one of the largest battles in medieval Italy between the followers of the Pope, now in Avignon, and the followers of the Holy Roman Emperor.
Okay.
And as you're speaking, I was thinking, of course, of ancient Rome, Caesar, et cetera. But the more you began to talk, the more I began to think about the impact of the Holy Roman Empire in the reframing of a lot of perhaps these ideas. And I'm not a Byzantinist, so I'm coming at it from a different side. 1325, when Mansa Musa goes on the Hajj in Cairo, who are the biggest funders of El Nasser Muhammad, the Sultan? It's the Copts, right? And where are they getting their funding? Probably from trade further south. When you talk about the double-headed eagles, right? Those appear on the coronation robe of the Holy Roman Emperor. And they also appear on bronze casting of a similar robe in the middle of Nigeria. So I'm wondering if there's so many different sort of details of all of this that you're sort of picking at elements, but I'm wondering why you choose to go back to Rome and sort of skipping over a sizable chunk of time, as opposed to thinking through how this might be played out vis-a-vis the Holy Roman Empire.
So only recently have Nubian scholars started to find evidence that lets us think about what Nubia's connections were to Europe in this period. And in part, that's because the evidence is very, very small, and in part because it's very, very southern, right? So one of the things that, when we do find one of these things, they're fascinating. I've got a text from Khazar Ibrahim that I look at, and I look at, and I look at, and I can't get anybody to convince me it's not Italian, right? So, okay, that's strange. There's this Italian prayer to the Virgin Mary in medieval Nubia. We have another case much further south of a graffito that appears to be in Provençal, right? And so clearly, you know, it's basically nothing more than I was here, except that it was I was here in Provençal. Very strange text. Yeah, and so we get evidence of at least Mediterranean Europeans poking around in that part of the world. There is comparably good or bad, depending on how you measure it, evidence of Nubians going and doing the same thing that some Ethiopians were doing, and that is traveling to Rome as part of the let's talk about our church union, this sort of thing. But very, very few scattered examples that are very hard to form a unified picture of. And those are, as I said, purely Southern European connections. There's nothing that I know of that shows of any awareness of anything further north, either deeper into France or in what we might call Germany, and no sense of any awareness of what the political structures were in those regions. The Nubians can talk about the politics in Egypt, they can talk about the politics in the Middle East, they can talk about Byzantine politics, but there's nothing in the sources that tells me they can talk about European politics at all.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting talk. I wish we had access to some of your texts to actually discuss some of the terminology with you in more depth. But I guess I wanted to follow up a little bit more on the importance of, first of all, difference in practice between these modes of Christianity, the different languages, different liturgies, as you noted in the separation of the monasteries. I'm a musicologist, and I work with Ethiopic and with various liturgies in Ethiopia. And I'm curious, you started at the end just now in your comments to talk a little bit about exchange and contact, but you really did have an appreciable Ethiopian clerical Christian Orthodox presence in Italy from 14th, 15th century, certainly, and there's documentation for artists, Italian artists and such in the Ethiopian courts during the Portuguese period in particular. And I'm just wondering how much of this, especially when you look at the chronicles of the 18th and 19th century, plus all the issues inherent in the dating of the Kebra Nagast, how much of this is late and kind of post facto. I'm wondering then if your connections between the early Nubian references and the later Ethiopian references are in fact of a cloth.
That's fair. I think that if the main line of your argument is that a lot of these references to Rome and connections to Rome creep in as these texts are being recopied by people who are reinterpreting them on the fly in the context of current events, I would say that I don't have a good answer to that. But my sense is that a lot of the church fathers and a lot of the late antique texts that are being recopied have to inform that reinterpretation at the same time. So in other words, they have the past and the present with them simultaneously as they're rethinking these texts. And so I think that they're going to be tapping into both legacies. And there are just too many examples with too many different manuscript variations from too many different places in northern Ethiopia for us to say, well, there are a few people here who know what's going on with the Portuguese and the Jesuits and all of this. And this is their interpretation of current events. To my mind, quantitatively, I think it has to go deeper than that. That may be an influencing factor. I can't think it's the only factor. Now, in terms of the Nubian evidence, I blush to put Nubian literature next to Ethiopian literature because the surviving evidence in terms of quantity, you're talking about many orders of magnitude difference, right? The Nubian corpus is just too small for me to do anything other than argue by anecdote, which I hate doing, but that's what we work with at this point. So we're still digging. God bless the archaeologists. I hope they keep finding more for us to read.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have two questions and an anecdote. One, there are several sovereigns who take the Holy Roman Empire title, one way or the other, to lay credibility to the status. Would you put the Ethiopian and the Nubian in the same, just in the same scale as the other? This is one. The second, so I'll ask them all quickly. The second, you are talking about the sovereigns. You're not talking much about the people. Is there a clear distinction that you can point out? I assume there are. And the anecdote is, I'm Israeli, and a few years after the peace agreement with Egypt, Israel had to decide between the Ethiopians and Copts about the right to 2 square feet of a stair, who cleans it, and there was a major diplomatic fiasco because of it. We decided, I think, for the Egyptians. For
the Ethiopians always get the raw end of that deal. No, absolutely. Well, so this goes back in part to your question about identity, right? I think that I want to know who these people would have included in their us, who their sense of us is. And I think that that sense of us only extended as far as Byzantium. I don't think it would have extended to recognition of any of these other claims, in part because all of these civilizations in the Nile Valley grew up in parallel and very deeply interrelated to each other, not really knowing what's going on with these other civilizations that are also growing up in parallel to each other. It's like having a cousin you don't know, right? 23andMe may tell you that's your cousin, but do you care?
But would you put it on the same par with the same family of claims?
Yes, but same family of claims is not the same as identity, right? And the second question was, the relationship between the people and the king in this regard. Now, this is a real problem, because who does the writing in Nubia? Well, the clergy does the writing. And so we have very little sense of what the people think about anything in medieval Nubia. But we know that the clergy as a category is also the category that produces all the high office holders, right? So almost all of the kings, almost all of the eparchs, almost all of the high-ranking bigwigs have cousins or brothers or sons or whatever who are monks and bishops and priests who are the ones who are doing the writing. And so there's a big black hole when you talk about what the Nubian people thought was going on, but when you talk about what everybody other than the king who was literate thought was going on, you have very much a set of vested interests of the people who are literate being the people who want to prop up the importance of the king because that's my brother.
Yeah, I too really enjoyed your talk, and it opened whole new areas for me. I too have two questions. One, you spoke in depth in a really fascinating way about the contacts between Nubia in the north and Nubia and Ethiopia. I'm wondering about Nubia and south and Nubia and west, whether there's any evidence of that, and if so, where. And my second question relates to a statement you made that medieval Nubia, or whatever we call it, cut itself off completely from the past. And while I would say Islamic Egypt also thought it had cut itself off completely from the past, in fact, there are many continuities between Pharaonic Egypt and Islamic Egypt, and I think we've only begun to scratch the surface there. So my question would be, with such an incredible civilization as ancient Meroe, is there, or further to the north, Karanog, is there no continuity between any of the ancient traditions that fall into the church practices, perhaps not in the liturgy, but in material culture or anything like that?
Short answer, I don't think so. Longer answer, you have to keep in mind that there is almost a 200-year gap between the last royal tombs of Meroe and the point at which we can confidently trace the historical and political evolution of the medieval Nubian kingdoms. And so there's a lot of disruption that's there. There's a 200-year gap between the last royal tombs in the Meroitic sequence of pyramids and the point at which we can start naming names of the political leaders of the Nubian kingdoms that succeed them. So from the 350s, 360s, skip forward till the reign of Justinian, and you get the 540s, 550s, you can start doing Nubian political history again. At that point, they've shifted languages, they've shifted political sites, they've moved where their capitals are. They've abandoned the sequence of burials that they had been keeping for half a millennium. And the jewelry, the iconography, the way they're doing their funerary structures, it's all different. So something very serious has happened, right? Whatever continuity there may be, and there's always continuity, runs very deep. It's not obvious at the level of what we can dig up and see. Nubian scholars, since Bill Adams made this argument 50 years ago, have tended to see Nubian civilization as the continuous history of a single people over thousands of years. But that's a people that started doing things very differently and started speaking very differently in that 200-year gap. So Meroitic is in the same language category as Old Nubian. It's a Nilo-Saharan language, right? But that category is broad enough you can drive a truck through it, and it's not a very helpful way to analyze the transition. You don't go from one to the other in 200 years in the way you might go from bad Latin to early Italian, right? So it's not a natural evolution. It's the wholesale adoption of a new language that is a distant cousin language, but not one that you naturally evolve from one into the other. Unfortunately, I've already forgotten your first question. Oh, right. I thought this was where you were going with your comment about Nigeria, because this is one of the things that people have started doing with the Nilo-Saharan linguistic scholarship is trying to figure out what is happening with some of those continuities and connections with the Chadic languages in particular. And so it's fairly obvious when you talk about Kordofan and Darfur in Sudan that the quote-unquote medieval Nubians must have been doing something in those regions. There are too many levels of similarity in terms of folklore, in terms of sort of ancestral memories of the way we used to do things, in terms of some of the shared vocabulary politically. For example, the term uru that I used shows up in places way deep in the west of Sudan that it doesn't linguistically, etymologically belong. And so we can assume from the linguistic evidence that there's a whole lot of continuity and connection, that the people in the river valley were going way further west than we would have realized just from the material cultural evidence. And so some people have started to say, well, what were they doing out there? Trade being one of the obvious possibilities. If they're running these cross-Saharan caravan routes that we don't know about, then there's probably a whole lot of reception going on the other side that we're still haven't even begun to discover yet.
Thanks, Nino. Predictably, I wanted to ask you a question that actually followed the second one that was just asked. And I'm going to kind of flip it around since she already asked a good portion of what I wanted to know about, which you mentioned this disconnect between the Nubian perspective and particularly the rhetoric of the basis of their sovereignty, pointing to the Mediterranean, essentially. But I was wondering, in terms of the material culture aspect of that, you talked about how there don't seem to be strong continuities in terms of symbolism, and I assume that's true in aspects of architecture as well.
Right.
But are there direct references where they're drawing upon symbolic repertoires, architectural repertoires, or other aspects of material culture that are supporting this rhetorical gesture towards...
Rhetorical gesture in terms of pointing to the Mediterranean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the most interesting things, there are a series of what you might call statelets or emerging states fill the gap between the Meroitic civilization and the emerging Christian Nubian kingdoms of the Nile Valley. And one of the most famous of these, the Nobadai and the Blemias, are two people who are competing for power in the Nile Valley in the wreckage of the Meroitic state in the 400s, the 500s. And the most famous case is the King Silko inscription, where there is a nice image of the king being crowned by an angel descending from the heavens. And it looks very Byzantine, but done in the way that I might do it if I were trying to kind of carve out of a mud brick. It's a little bit inelegant, and it uses Greek terminology to refer to King Silko, not as a basileus king, but as a little basileus, right? A little king. Well, a little king in reference to whom? Well, the big king, presumably, the one to the north. And so I think that's what some modern scholars have pointed to as the turning point. Now, this happens at practically the northernmost possible point in Nubia, right? The place where there's all kinds of comings and goings between Egypt and Nubia in terms of trade, in terms of travel, in terms of monasticism, in terms of the Christian evangelical component. So I guess that's where you would expect it to take place, right? The first sign that you're getting some sort of kingship from God, that has some sort of relationship to kingship with a capital B, Basileus, in the Mediterranean world. Again, it's an isolated example. We want to know how it evolves over time. Now all that stuff's underwater. So, we don't know how much we lost, in short, in terms of the evidence.
Whether the architectural repertoire associated with royalty is drawing on local traditions of construction or architectural form.
Well, a lot of it's reuse, and that's always the case in Egypt and Nubia, is you have these buildings that are hundreds and even thousands of years old, and you just you repurpose them. Sometimes you might redirect their orientation and make it face the way you want it to face. There's relatively little that I can think of in terms of new architecture in this period.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
So I have kind of a series of interrelated questions. One is kind of looking back from the kind of Islamic perspective. If you talk about these kind of interrelations of kind of Nubia interceding in Egypt when they felt that Copts were being unfairly persecuted, or kind of various other interventions as well, are there things like that are happening with, say, Fatimid, Ayyubid, or Mamluk interventions in Nubia or Ethiopia when Muslims are being persecuted? And then I also want to go back to this question of imperial versus kind of the layperson, the everyday experience of the population.
Right.
And you talk a lot about kind of archaeological evidence just not being there, but then I feel like that maybe relies very heavily on written sources versus kind of other material culture.
Guilty.
And so I wonder about like the ceramic evidence and exchange and how we can use that to reflect on what the everyday person is experiencing, which also might break down some of these questions of Muslim versus Christian, which I don't know would have been as strong for the average person.
Right. So the Fatimid versus Mamluk versus Ayyubid question is an interesting one. We have very poor evidence of the rise of Islam in Nubia. I really wish that we had better information on this, and I think it's going to be one of the new breakthroughs in medieval Nubian scholarship, is starting to understand Islamization better. I don't like the term, but it's a useful term. We have hardly any evidence, therefore, for persecution of Muslims under Christian rule. We have some evidence for Muslim burials safely within the Christian period, and we have some evidence for what we might sort of sloppily call Muslim quarters in the Christian cities. And so we know that the communities were there. We just don't know what they were doing or how they got there or who they were. In some cases, I mean, the Nubians today clearly say, well, we're Muslims who are descended from Christians. And so they know that their history is one of conversion at some point, right? So it's not as if Muslims showed up and took over Nubia. Nubians became Muslims. Maybe at the same time Muslims were showing up. We just don't quite know how those intersect yet. The other aspect to your question, this is so interesting, is that the Fatimids, how do we say this, had other problems, right? They spent hundreds of years more worried about what the rest of the Muslim world thought about them than they did about what was going on in Nubia. And this is the best time in Nubian history because it's the only time in Nubian history they're not worried about their northern border. Things with the Fatimids were fantastic. The Bakht, which is the treaty, or well, maybe it wasn't a treaty, maybe it was just a gift exchange relationship between Nubia and the Muslim authorities, kept up and was maintained for hundreds of years under the Fatimids. Sorry? 700 years. But it was least disturbed under the Fatimid period, right? Because the Fatimids didn't want to have to worry about what's going on down there, right? The minute the Fatimids are out of office, boom, you've got problems, right? In other words, the minute you have Sunni rule in Egypt instead of Shiite rule, that's when you've got a problem for Nubian Christianity. There was a ninth question in there somewhere. Oh, the material cultural, yeah, so this is interesting. If you had no text, God forbid, and all you could do was dig, the best evidence would be, well, they're still texts, they're monograms, right? One of the things that they did a lot was they would create cryptograms that were the names of archangels or the names of saints or the names of other people, in which you would basically add up the numeric values of each letter in the name and then write that number. But you're writing the number in Greek, so you're writing it in letters anyways. So you would have a RNB, and that would be Michael, right? Or you would have whatever the numeric equivalent is for Raphael or for Uriel or for Mary. And some of these we haven't even figured out yet. You know, there's a good computer science project for somebody who's willing to write the computer program that will reverse engineer all of the cryptograms numerically. Like, what possible name could have this numeric value? And that's where the ceramic evidence tells you about the sort of the Islamization process. In the ceramic layers, when you stop getting monograms, the styles don't change. They're just not monogramming their stuff anymore. Muslim pottery? Yeah, probably.
I wonder also just though about like exchange among kind of so-called peripheral towns between these two regions. Like I'm thinking of just like Greg Williams' research looking at like how ceramics are being like moved around through towns that are showing like kind of greater affinities that are like kind of breaking across these so-called borders.
Right. There are some people who are doing good Sudanese, Ethiopian, borderland medieval archaeology. As far as I know, the best of it is still forthcoming. In other words, we've had some people poke around, and some of those people, unfortunately, are not with us anymore, scholarly. And so I think the answer is still, we don't know yet. I tend to take the view that the literary evidence is a representative sample of what actually happened and was visible at the center in terms of what was going on in the periphery. So when you sort of shave off the Mount Everests and you tunnel down to what was typical, what that tells you by reduction is that there was relatively little periphery interaction, at least between Nubia and Ethiopia. And whatever there is, we'll discover at some level, and we'll be arguing about it and debating about it. So far, I haven't seen a lot that's convinced me. Let's put it that way.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really happy that you encouraging researchers to dig more deeply on how this wonderful kingdom, talking about the Christian Nubia, vanished. But as maybe Rita related to the movement to the south or to the west, as you can see that still we have Nubian in Kordofan who are still Christian, despite the, I don't know how I agree with you. I don't know how Islam got into that area. I know some scholars were sent by the, from Baghdad, they came in and they settled and they managed to maneuver or change the demographic of that area. But the resistance of the southern Nubian in Kordofan, maybe we look for the trend. They live now in mountain, which was far away from any Arabization or Islamization for that thing, or wouldn't you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I think that in my alternative fantasy life, I'd be an anthropologist or ethnographer poking around down there and asking living people a lot of questions about what their traditional memories tell us. Because some of the most interesting written sources, I hate to use that because that makes them sound like primary sources, but they're not, are actually British colonial people who went poking around down there interviewing the great grandnephew of the last king of that hill there in the hills. And one of the things that they found when they did that work was coronation ceremonies and other practices that looked like the stuff we see painted on the walls in the Nile Valley in Christian Nubian churches. And that's stuff that was in the 1800s. So I think there's probably a lot more of that deep continuity still hidden there than we really realize. I don't know how to get at it, and I'm definitely not the right person to get at it. I hope somebody does.
So thank you very much. I think my question is best framed as a comment, really. So I'll put a question mark at the end of the comment. But so the first of our conferences, Medieval/Africa, ended with a very fine sort of response session in which the European medievalists present, I was one of those, were reflecting on the way in which the historiography of Europe, particularly the place of the term medieval in that historiography, is nearly contemporary with European colonization of Africa. It's a second half of the 19th century development. And a number of us who work within the category of medieval as Europeanists have as vexed a relationship with that term as you do. Yeah. In fact, it's a term which should be under crisis for everybody working in the field, although we still identify with it. It's like, the word Christian, it's sort of used as it's a label that's plastered on from the outside, and you just kind of end up inhabiting within it. But there's a sense in which the kind of conclusion of that first conference from the point of view of the medieval Europeanists there was that European imperialism had at the same time as it was performing these aggressive international acts, was actually aggressively colonizing its own past in a particular kind of form. And so the way the word medieval got used in relation to, let's call it primitive Europe or Dark Age Europe, another term that was around at the time, has some direct relationship to the application of those sorts of labels to other parts of the world as well. So for you to problematize the word medieval seems completely right in relation to thinking about medieval Nubia, though I noticed you go on using the term constantly at the same time. And that's sort of what we do too, if we're working on this. But I do think it sounds like a medieval culture in using medieval in the unmarked way, in terms of the sorts of ceremonies you're talking about, the kinds of documents, the kinds of genres as a literary scholar. In fact, the kinds of ways you extract evidence from hagiography and episcopal, I'm not sure what that documentary role was called and so on, seems thoroughly congruous with the way that we would think about medieval textual culture. So I'm actually heartened that there might be exchanges, particularly in the way in sort of genre studies, across these things. I guess that is a comment, but I'll put a question mark.
Well, there's a lot to respond to there, and one of the things that you can talk about in terms of the intellectual history of our respective traditions is the fact that Nubian studies people, along with Ethiopian studies people, have started, I don't want to say breaking down the doors, but the medievalists have been receptive. We've been putting on panels at Leeds at the International Medieval Conference for the last few times around, to I think, very useful results in terms of talking about that cross-fertilization. I think you're right. I think it feels medievally when you talk about the genres. The only thing that's really missing are the legal texts. In terms of codification of law, the Nubians just don't seem to have done that. It doesn't seem to have been useful for them in any way. No. Lists, right? The bearer bones forms of chronicles. You'll get episcopal and royal lists. But the other thing to think about in terms of the intellectual history of all of this, I think that as somebody who got his start in the history of Roman late antiquity, the concept of the Dark Ages just drives me batty because I look at late antiquity as a period of continuity. There is immense, deep underlying, pervasive sameness from the 4th to the 5th to the 6th to the 7th centuries. What do you lose? You lose the state. Boo-hoo. You know, the book that I just put out on Aphrodite, I make the argument that from the point of view of these villagers, there was no state. It didn't matter to them who was running the show. What mattered to them was who they could influence at a personal level for patronage and leverage. And so if those are the kind of continuities you're talking about, you know, there is no birth of the Middle Ages in Europe from that point of view at all. And likewise, the birth of the Nubian kingdoms may equally be irrelevant on the ground. We just don't have the good evidence to really get at what these people were thinking about as their states emerged. It may have not made a difference to them that their states emerged. It made a difference to us because it lets us bookend the political history of the period. It may not have mattered to the people all that much.
I think we're going to have to, I would just add to that I remind everyone, Jacques Le Goff famously remarked that for the peasant in the Auvergne, the Middle Ages ended around 1820. So this is a similar kind of thing. There's a very long durée, Middle Ages, that goes probably from 200 to 1800. And it sounds like it's similar for the African case as well. So thank you very much, Giovanni.
Thank you. Thank you.